Apologies as I'm running into a little bit of a cold, so I'll be a little raspy for the voice, but we'll have some fun with it. I'm a relatively informal speaker, so if there are questions during the talk, just raise your hand, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end for a quick dialogue and maybe reinforce some of the points that we made throughout. I left the corporate world and spent about 10 years working with entrepreneurs, helping mostly friends write business plans, get funding, and then I would often take an operational role in a company as either CEO or VP of marketing, something along those lines. I then became an angel investor, so I joined Sandhill Angels, and I can talk a little bit about the angel investment community there, and I know that was a big set of subject matter here. And then in 2008, I was asked by the Canadian government to join them as their local IT specialist, helping Canadian companies connect with the Valley. So I worked there for 3 years and set up their pipeline, taking companies that were pretty raw, going up in the country, running boot camps, bringing them down for extended periods of time and getting them exposure to the Valley. And I'll talk a little bit about that process. And then I currently work at the newest and largest accelerator in the Valley called Nest GSV, and a little symbol there. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly, and this is not an advertisement, I'll talk mostly about the culture of accelerators and what the current trends are there, and then I'll wrap up with a little bit of culture on what's going on. So there's a lot to cover, and we'll hit right into it. What I'd like to do is to start off, I attended a class at Stanford with Jose as lecturer, and this was put up by Burton Lee, who's one of the professors there, and he talked a lot about the difference between regional and global, and I was really struck by this map of Europe and all the various regions. I think every company has to start thinking global from the start. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, unless you're going to confine yourself to just simply the local market, form your companies with a global perspective. Carlos talked a lot about the startup genome and reported some of the facts. I didn't know that coming in, so I had written this presentation, and I wanted to talk a lot about the startup ecosystem and what goes on. And this report's pretty interesting because it's the start of the lean startup process, which is build, measure, learn, and repeat that cycle over and over again. So this is the measurement portion. These ecosystems have been built. We're now measuring and comparing them against each other, learning from that, and trying to improve on them all the way throughout. And I think that was a theme that I heard throughout the talk here today. Carlos gave these rankings just to say that they looked at 50 different ecosystems, set up a rating process, and ranked and reported on the top 20. And I'm going to talk about a few of them that I think are interesting. So there's Silicon Valley. Hi, that's my home. The way they measured was they took these 8 measurement points and their startup output, amount of funding available, the performance of those funds from a return standpoint, the overall mindset, if you will, or culture of the area, whether it's a trendsetter, setting new standards, whether it's different than Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is not different than Silicon Valley, so that gets good marks. What sort of support infrastructure they have, and that has a lot to do with the service provider community, the lawyers, the accountants, the recruiters, everybody else, and just the raw amount of talent that's available. So if you benchmark Silicon Valley as the one, and by the way, we're not perfect. I mean, there's a lot of things that are wrong or need to get fixed in the Valley too, but you got to start somewhere. So they set this as a benchmark. The report then goes through these various statistics, and if this is available online, I strongly encourage you to download it. This is part 1 that's available, and there are other parts that are coming. But for those of us that are students of international ecosystems, this does an excellent job in breaking things out and giving statistics that I actually trust, which is unusual for a lot of these reports. It also invokes the Steve Blank methodology. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a professor from Berkeley and Stanford that does a lot with this build, measure, learn methodology, and this whole idea of customer discovery, customer validation, customer creation, and company building as a series of tools that are set up to start companies. So I strongly recommend also you get the what's the name of the book? God, the startup method or something along those lines. It'll come to me in a minute. Startup Owner's Manual. Thank you very much. So he talks about customer discovery and the funding per stage. So at this point, you don't necessarily know what you're going to build. You have a hypothesis of what a good product or service might be, and you're going around testing that. At this stage, if you have a good enough idea with some testing under your belt that a funding entity would take a look at and thinks that makes sense, you could raise on average up to $650,000. What you don't see in the Valley, and I heard a little bit about this, is people asking for $25,000 or even $50,000. That is really something where you're self-funded for the most part, or you might hit up one of your friends or family for a little bit of money. But once you get above, say, $150,000, $250,000, that's the point at which you can go to angels or some of these things, and there's a little bit of discussion on there. Customer validation, you've now got a product, you're out there testing in the marketplace, usually what they call beta site, and those valuations are somewhere, or the amount of funding you can receive is on average about $2.5 million. Efficiency is the point where you're streamlining your process and getting out, and then scaling is growing the company. And you deal with different investors at each one of those stages. So this is pretty interesting. If you take a look at the line items in black and the one right below it, VC and super angel or mini VC. These are small funds, typically 2 or 3 people that have emerged to fill some gaps between angel and VC. So between VC, super angel, 16 and 12% respectively, you're looking at 28% of overall capital being raised on what was traditionally the largest single portion of capital 10 years ago. But that's been usurped by self-funding, which has always been there, friends and family, which has been there but at a lesser level, accelerators and incubators, which are new sources of funding, and angels, which have really stepped in. So in terms of actual amounts of funds, early on, actual stage, the discovery stage, you get a little bit of funding that's being spread around the Valley. Validation is the majority. That's the portion at which the company is right there at this point in the hockey stick, and a lot of VCs and other entities are looking to take advantage of that. And then later on, you get fewer and fewer deals, but they happen to be larger in size. The amount of jobs being created each one of those stages, when you hockey stick, when you scale, when you're up here, then all of a sudden the jobs really start to get created. So the larger companies are more efficient at job creation. Where do they get their revenue streams? Various places. I think it's pretty interesting. These are largely web-based models. First off, 43 of startups have no paying customers, so they're figuring things out. They're giving things away for free. They're trialing stuff as you go. So nearly half of startups have no revenues whatsoever. But those that do, you have a variety of things, and this is called business model creation. So you're experimenting with ways in which to extract value from your customers. And there's always new business models being created. But right now, if you think about what you pay for in terms of technology products, subscribing to them, doing a transaction fee that is a one-off when you buy it, just looking at advertising, although it's talked about a lot, does not generate that much revenue, license fees and others. So I thought this was interesting. Excuse me. Different types of startups. Again, in the interest of time, I won't belabor this. Take a look at the report. It's pretty interesting. This is cool, though. Steve Blank methodology. He talks about the type of market, and the type of market that you're entering into makes all the difference in terms of how you go to market, what your sales strategies are. So there's existing markets where you have products and services being sold by others. You enter into that market thinking that you can do better than the others. So that's the better methodology. That's about a third of the companies. Cheaper and niche are something called resegmenting markets. So you're taking an existing market and you're doing a twist on it. You're either making a cheaper, lower cost, more efficient product, cheaper, or you're taking an existing product line and maybe you're rebranding it, or you're putting an extra widget on it. But it's the same basic product but tweaked in order to get out there and exploit a gap in the marketplace. And then new, these are brand new types of products that never existed before that are trying to serve a new market. These are the ones that have to, I'm using a lot of Silicon Valley buzzwords here, have to cross the chasm, have to get from the point at which their initial products into mass market, and that gap for new product is difficult because you're doing a lot of education and evangelism and trying to get things out there. But it's a good mix. The fact that we've got so many new products happening, I think, is great, and that's really the engine of change. Metrics, build, measure, learn. Well, it turns out that not everybody does that. About 58% of companies review their metrics, and 59% of companies directly monetize their users. So in that view, not everybody is doing the perfect things, but we have room to improve. But who pays? This is kind of interesting. Consumers, small and medium-sized enterprises, and enterprise customers represent each about a third. So we're not just attacking the consumer market as is often thought. So that's just some thoughts on Silicon Valley and what's going on. And along each one of those 8 measurements that we talked about earlier, they compare different ecosystems. Tel Aviv is deemed number 2 in the world, and when Jose spoke, actually talking about different ecosystems and what he aspired to be in terms of development, the example he brought up was Israel, which I agree with. So take a look at this. Now all of a sudden you get some pretty distorted curves. So in this case, the funding is there in their world, the support system is there, the talent is there, and startups are cranking. But other than that, it's lacking quite a bit. So they're not creating really different products. They're not setting any trends around. They're largely getting into existing industries for the most part. And as such, their performance, the return on investment for investors, is relatively low. So this is one of those things, build, measure, learn, where Israel, I'm sure, will be opening up this report and trying to figure out how can they become better at these measurements if they believe that these measurements apply to them and they want to improve along those lines. New York City, this is an interesting one. It's a lot more balanced. And they're cranking, they've got good funding, the performance is reasonable, good mindset, and so on. So what's lacking there is talent. Well, that can be fixed, just over time through education, through importing new startups, and so on. So New York City is on pretty good footing. And in fact, well, I won't advertise, but at least my organization, the second accelerator that we're opening up outside of Silicon Valley is in New York. So we believe this as well is a ripe location for startup activity. I'm going to go through some of the European cities. So London. I was surprised to learn that London was not a trendsetter and wasn't different. I would have suspected something else, but this is again the results of that survey. But otherwise, they're looking pretty good. Paris, not so much. So return on investment is strong. Differentiation, of course, the Parisians are different. I know that. They've got a good support infrastructure because they believe in themselves, but pretty much everything else doesn't exist for them. So they've got a long way to go in order to create something that's sustainable over time. And I think their performance so far has been distorted just simply because of their individuality and mindset. Berlin, this one shocked me. I mean, look at that. Trendsetter, yes. You hear about Berlin inventing all kinds of great things and being a trendsetter, somebody who's modernizing the world and so on, but nothing else exists. I don't know what else. A little bit of funding, a little bit of talent. That's cool. Sao Paulo. Now all of a sudden, this is my last one. We get into the Portuguese-speaking world. Looking at this, I don't know enough about the economy in Portugal. I'm learning as we go. But as I was looking at these graphs, I actually thought that this one was kind of similar to what I would have guessed for Portugal. So this will be an interesting discussion we can have over dinner. We break this open and we'll solve problems both here and there. So if you take a look at it from a global distribution standpoint, first it is distributed, which is great news. So these are out of 20 companies. So 9 of them are in North America, 3 from Canada, which is surprising. I'll take a little bit of credit for that, having helped a lot of Canadian entrepreneurs. But the 6 cities from the US are all in the top 10. 5 cities in Europe, the 3 I showed, including Tel Aviv, but Moscow is always in that, already in that. 2 in Asia, Bangalore in India and Singapore were the 2 most innovative economies, but nothing in China, which shocked me. So it wasn't Shanghai, it wasn't Beijing, it wasn't Guangzhou, all these places that you hear about, they're just megaliths in terms of inventing brand new economies. They're not startup economies at this point, at least according to this study. Australia ranked high, and 2 in Latin America, those are Sao Paulo and Santiago. So a lot going on, and I think that's great news. I'll talk a little bit about how those economies are connecting in just a bit. So what I read from this is now we have a way to measure some of these ecosystems in a way that makes common sense, to me at least. Every one of those ecosystems is different. You can now compare and contrast the various attributes and identify their strengths and weaknesses. And the right way, in my view, to improve an ecosystem is through involving the community. It just can't be government, or just can't be universities, or just can't be corporations, or just can't be the startups themselves. Everybody pulling together and trying to make things better. So if you're trying to operate as an entrepreneur on a global stage, you're competing with all these other ecosystems. And you've got limited resources in your own country, and that's true for every country. You're dealing with limited resources in terms of the number of customers you can serve, the number of strategic partnerships you can have, the number of service providers that are there, or even the ones that know how to deal with startups. Because right now, like say attorneys, I don't know how many attorneys in Lisbon deal with startups and startup issues, but I suspect that's probably a challenge. Same on the accounting side, same on the recruiter side, and so on. And then funding is all, at least once you start to break out of these major markets. It's funny, as we start to get further down the chain in terms of ratings, funding became smaller and smaller of an overall component of what was available. So money follows talent. Money follows possible returns. So the extent that you build an ecosystem that has strong talent and strong returns, the money will come. So don't bring money first. It should be part of the overall ecosystem development. So if you're a company trying to grow on a global scale, the local market is much different than global markets, that we know. But some advice, and that is entering a brand new market is just like doing a brand new startup. You should go through the processes. So, start with some businesses start with a global reach, but once you've gotten to the point where you have made a market entry, your product is developed, you've got your first customers, you've got some traction, and you have adequate resources to keep your local market and consider expansion, in other words, you're not dropping the ball, then you can take a look at where to expand. First recommendation is adjacent territories. Adjacent territories mean if you have a similar language, you have a similar culture, or they're the guys next door. If that territory is underserved, if you have a product that requires on-site delivery or service, you have to physically be there. If the barriers to entry are low, and if they have similar demographics or customer tastes, it's probably the easiest way for you to jump into a new market. So whether here it may be Spain or Europe, or whether it might be a Portuguese-speaking country anywhere in the world, these are sort of logical choices, at least for the companies here. But then how to do it? Well, again, expansion into a new geography is just like doing a brand new startup. You have to deal with all the same things, from customer discovery to customer validation. You have to know the competitive landscape and who's out there. You have to understand what pricing models are, what your channel partners would look like. So again, my friends, there it is. The Startup Owner's Manual does a really good job in covering this from a tools perspective. It gives you the tools to go ahead and take a look at each one of those stages of a company and cycles and measure what you're doing. I really suggest that once you're in a market, you have some data, do full financials. See if it's going to be worth it, because it is a stretch. Identify your funding needs, whether there or here. Then you develop a full launch strategy. You might have to redesign the product in the meantime, but then full launch strategy, tactics, and go. Silicon Valley. So when I was dealing with the Canadians, I was getting first calls before we'd set up these structures. And they said, I want to come down to the Valley for a week. I'm just going to raise some money and then go back home and go start working. Can you set up all the VC meetings for me? Is that all right? Yeah, okay, fine, I'll do that. So the perception, at least in this case, and I'm making fun of Canadians, is that we're just basically a funding barrel. We had bags full of money, so on, and ready to hand them out. Well, of course not. The one thing that I recommend for foreign companies as well is this trend called reverse outsourcing. I'm going to go through a little bit of funding mentality and so on, but reverse outsourcing for a country like Portugal. What that means is, once you've developed your traction here within market, you can take a couple of scouts. It might be your CEO, might be your VP of business development, might be your VP of marketing, might be all three. Peel them off of the company. Let the company continue to run, make sure management is stable, and go head off to a different market. It could be Silicon Valley, it could be Sao Paulo, it could be whatever you'd like. But go to that market, create a subsidiary, go ahead and get the management and business development people started on sales in that market. And then you might have the possibility of funding within that market to the extent it exists. So what you have is now an outpost in another country. Those people are making business decisions, but the bulk of your engineering and the bulk of your operations people are still here in Portugal, as an example. That's a growable and sustainable model. It happens a lot, because outside the country you need access to additional customers, additional resources, additional access to different service providers, additional partners, and so on, and grow the company organically that way. So whenever you hear a lot of these discussions about Silicon Valley, blah, 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 it's not a function of taking foreign companies and moving them lock, stock, and barrel. It's a cooperative development environment where you can go ahead and get access to those things you need to grow. And that's the pipeline that we set up for Canada, and it worked. I've accelerated over the course of 2.5 years, 55 companies. None of them moved, not one. So I consider it to be a success. In the US, if you want to get funding, well, how would you go about it? It's not that guy with bags of money. Few things. First, VCs have a 20-mile rule. So they're responsible for investing in companies and then actively managing them. What that means is they want to go visit you, they want to go talk to you, they want to go yell at you, they want to kick your butts, they want to get things going to the next step. And they're a little lazy. I'll talk about mentality in a minute, but they won't drive within 20 miles of where they are. Plus, they have very expensive sports cars that break down all the time. So that Tesla is not going to have very much range, so 20 miles is about it. If you're trying to get funded in the US, the Portuguese expats, the Portuguese-speaking population that lives there, it's not huge, but they're powerful, and they want to give back. They want to help. So seek them out and take advantage of their goodwill. And if they're a VC, awesome. If they're not a VC, well, they may know some, and they may make those introductions and open those doors for you. So take advantage of that capability. If you're getting funded, if you have one sniff, if you have one possible lead investor, get that person to go ahead and syndicate. VCs have strong relationships. They're willing to do deals as a group. So if they may invest $100,000 into you or $250,000, they'll get their friends and their friends' friends to go ahead and pull that together, and so on. So actually an endorsement by someone like Portugal Ventures in the Portuguese expat community would go a long way in allowing you to go ahead and seek additional sources of capital. But in Silicon Valley, the odds are against you. This is Sandhill Angels. These are my stats. So we see 60 new deals a month. Out of that, we vote online. We take a look at 8 every single month for a pre-screen meeting. That meeting's attended by about 20 members, and they take a look and they try to narrow that down to 3 meetings. The 3 companies, excuse me. Those 3 companies are then present to the entire group of about 80 people at a dinner meeting, and then out of that, we might make one investment, maybe. So out of 720 companies per year, we invest in 8. That's about 1%. That's about right. That ratio applies almost across the board for most semi-professional or professional investment groups. That applies for VCs and so on. So when you're fundraising, it's not unusual to have 20, 30, 40, 50 meetings. I funded a company after 80 meetings. But that's what you have to do sometimes. So just to say that it's not the guy with bags of money waiting for you. VCs, from the outside, look like they're very smart and very intelligent, have big brains, but actually they think in very small terms, present company accepted, of course. But what they're thinking about, to a large extent, is how much, here's a deal. I kind of like the deal. How much money should I put in? I don't know, but I'm really worried about how much money I can get out. So I want to put in relatively little. I want to see the company scale very quickly. I want to get rapid returns. But what's standing in my way. There's all these risk factors. And this is the reason why 99% of the companies get turned down. It's all the things that stand in the way from the return on investment that the VCs are looking for. And last, at least where I live, but not least, is this whole idea of what's in it for me. So they're part of the community. They're like to talk about how well they've done. And so you helping them get along those lines is a good thing for both. I won't dwell on the others, but just to give you an idea of the risk factors, the things that people look for and killing a deal. And that's what they're doing when you are pitching to them. They're looking for reasons to kill the deal. If you don't have a reason they don't have a reason to kill it, you'll get the next meeting. How's your team? First, you as a CEO have to be trusted. They have to like you. Second, they have to believe that your team is reasonable. It doesn't have to be complete, but at least reasonable and can do the job that's required of them. That kills probably 30 to 50% of all deals, just the team issues. Market risk, is the market big enough? That's this whole idea of global scale. Who are the competitors? Who's out there? If you're developing something that requires new technology, not like a web app, mobile app or something, but real hardcore material science or something, can you execute on that technology? Are there legal issues standing in the way? Are there patent claims that might be interfering with this investment? Was the company incorporated properly? Are there claims on the stock? So on. But these things bump stuff up, and that's process of due diligence. When they like you, they've generally decided in their mind to invest. You start the due diligence process. That due diligence, going through all of these things, takes 3 to 6 months. And I have a whole nother set of lectures on exactly what those are and how they all work. Happy to talk about it. But know that it's not something where you step in. You're never going to get a deal on your first meeting. It's going to take multiple meetings and to step you through everything. To actually get your meeting, they pretty much never take cold calls. You just can't say, hey, I'm new in town. I'm from Portugal, and I'd like to meet with you. No, the way it works is through introductions. And all the best deals really take place in the back room. You're introduced, you meet with them. A VC wants to know that they got to look at your deal first. They might be able to invest ahead of others and so on. So they talk amongst themselves. If I'm not investing in you, maybe I'll tell my friend. Or your attorney or your advisor might introduce you to a VC if they have a relationship. Or if they've invested in somebody, you can track down that guy and have him make an introduction, but it's all about introductions. In Silicon Valley, there are pitching contests pretty much every day. You can go out and you can talk to the world about your company and what it does. That's great. They're good for practice. And you do need to practice. But these public forums where you're pitching for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, no, not going to happen. All the stuff happens behind closed doors in back rooms. Accelerators. We've got a bunch of different kinds of accelerators and incubators. An accelerator, at least in our world, is can be a large or medium-sized facility that houses entrepreneurs but doesn't run on a particular schedule and may or may not be associated with a fund. We differentiate that from an incubator. An incubator is something that is run by a fund. They do hardcore selection of their class. It might be 10 to 20 companies. They bring in a class. They have them in for typically 10 to 12 weeks. They run them through a fixed program, and then they have a big demo day at the end. So they're taking companies in, giving them $25,000 to $50,000 initially, and then for usually between 3 and 10% equity, and then they're hoping at the end of those classes and the demo day and the hype that goes along with it, then their market valuation increases. We do have some small university accelerators, other accelerators, corporations run accelerators, a couple governments run accelerators, and so on. This is my accelerator called Nest GSV. GSV stands for Global Silicon Valley. We pride ourselves not just on being some real estate, but an actual community. Community itself consists of events. We run typically 3 events at least per week. We did 30 in November. Education, we have an education program, both an MBA-style education as well as ad hoc classes. A lot of corporate partners who want access to startups, a lot of service providers who want access to startups. We do have a real estate component. but service people outside of that. We have a fund. So we built this community around startups, universities, VCs, government agencies, service providers, companies, angel investors, so on. And it brings everybody together under one roof. And it's a microcosm of Silicon Valley. In fact, we don't call it an accelerator or an incubator, we call it ecobator for ecosystem. I didn't make that up. That's us. Nice place. That's what it looks like inside. Room for 500 startups. We just launched on September 27th. We already have 55 companies under roof. Again, events are a big deal. We have 5 event spaces under the roof. And about 40% international tenants. We have access to the full community, active connections, education program, and exposure to Silicon Valley culture. We're expanding into other areas of the world. So I mentioned New York, Dallas, Texas, Madison, Wisconsin as well. And right now we're doing interviews for other locations in places outside of the US. No announcements yet. But the idea is to connect all of those accelerators on a global basis so that when a corporation comes in and wants access to social gaming on a mobile platform that works for students that are in first grade, we can actually go out to our network, find the best of breed amongst all of the accelerators on the worldwide basis and bring them in so that corporate partner can take a look at them and evaluate them. So for that reason, we take the bias out of geography, finding best and brightest companies anywhere around the world. So last slide. Silicon Valley culture, you've heard a lot about it today. It's a sharing culture, it's a trusting culture. We have a great network. A lot of people want to give back. You can walk up to anybody and ask a favor, and 95% of the time they'll do something for you as best they can. And the other thing too is that even though we're an accelerator, we want people to get out of the building. We want you to network. We want you to run around and do what we can to help. So thank you.